All right, well, welcome this afternoon. Has anybody ever been to a baseball game? All right, let's start the wave. Everybody up over here and across. Come on, come on. There we go. All right, now let's go back the other way. Come on. All right, one more time. Come on, get it together, in sync. There we go. Go Red Sox. Okay. Hey, I make an annual trip, if possible, to the Mecca of baseball, Fenway Park. So we grew up Red Sox fans. My dad used to take us when we were kids there. And by the way, I did the wave because I was thinking, Miss Debbie must not like me. John, come and speak at 8 o'clock at night when everybody's half asleep on day 3. And then we want you to speak in the afternoon, right when everybody's about to fall asleep again. So I thought we'd at least get the blood pumping and get the thing going, okay? So let's just talk for a minute about, I want to give you a couple examples of Christian businessmen that founded businesses that you just might have heard of. And because I want it, in a sense, to be, aspirational, maybe inspiring, that you may look and say, I'm thinking about starting a business. Think about this, Henry Heinz. You ever heard of Heinz Ketchup, the H.J. Heinz Company? How about J. Howard Pugh? You ever heard of Sun Oil Company? You know that J. Howard Pugh, the Pugh Family Foundation, financed most of the construction at Grove City College. So you think about what the opportunity that's created by a business person that's very successful to fund Christian work. Asa Candler was the founder of Coca-Cola. Sam Walton, everybody heard of Walmart? He's a believer. Bud Paxson, Home Shopping Club. R.G. Letourneau, the Letourneau Foundation. Has anybody ever heard of R.G. Letourneau? A couple right there. He was basically kind of like an equivalent of Caterpillar, built large equipment, earth moving. He was coined by his peers, God's businessman. Here's the value system, or the way R.G. lived, is he lived on 10% and he gave 90% away to the Lord's work and funded all sorts of Christian charities, even internationally. Anthony Rossi, the founder of Tropicana. Henry Crowell, the Quaker Oats founder. David Green, founder of Hobby Lobby. Everybody's heard of David, I'm sure, and the family and the things that they've stood for. John Heiler, Heiler's Candy. J.L. Kraft's Foods. Max Dupre, the founder, he was the CEO, his family business of Herman Miller. Everybody heard of the Herman Miller, the office business? He was kind of Dutch Reformed up in that Grand Rapids area. So here you have all these Christian men that start businesses that ultimately end up being very successful, but the work that they do in their private lives with their foundations in giving is amazing. Here's a couple quotes. I wanted to read these. Again, for inspiration for all of us. I read these things and it gets me excited thinking about the potential of what we could do for the kingdom. R.G. Letourneau said, "I shovel out, but God shovels in. God shovels bigger." Pretty great quote. J.L. Kraft, the founder of Kraft Foods, says that the only investments I ever made which have paid constantly increasing dividends is the money that I have given to the Lord's work. Pastors do their congregations a great service by helping those in the church understand God's truths about money, time, and giving. So we've been talking about stewardship in the first lecture. Second lecture was about calling. See how we're laying the foundation, and we're going to start moving into really some of the meat of business and organizational structure and things like that. And hopefully you'll draw some very practical thoughts. And the next 2 lectures will get even more practical. Billy Graham said it like this: a checkbook is a theological document. It tells you who and what you worship. Let that sink in for a minute. I'll tell you another one. The calendar in your phone, or however you keep your calendar, there's 2 things: your time and your money. When you think about stewardship, God owns our time and our money. We've made that pretty clear, haven't we? Any questions? Well, that one was kind of easy. Thank you very much. Number 2, calling. At a minimum, I think we all recognize that calling is unique to each of us, and God's given us gifts and abilities, right? And I hope you've picked up on the thread that's been seamless through all of these called risk. And really what I'm trying to say when I talk about risk, and I've given a lot of kind of business qualifications of that, but risk is truly about understanding that we walk by faith, not by sight. In other words, so often, whether it's even in relationships, in business, in families, in the church, we want everything to just be lined out. In other words, what we want is 1 + 1 = 2. See, God's economy doesn't work like that. 1 + 1 sometimes might be 0. But 1 + 1 might be 10. It might be 100. We're called to walk by faith in a rational, logical way. So let's get into the meat of today's lecture. Today's lecture is really dealing with the second C. So the first C was calling. We're sailing the 4 C's together. The second one is construction, or the structures of a business. So here's what I want you to understand. First of all, first and foremost, that in a business of any type or size, there are 3 main organizational pieces. Doesn't matter what business you're in, doesn't matter what it is, you have 3 parts to a business. It's basic, it's simple, it's not complex. Doesn't matter how big the organization gets or how small it is. You hear what I said? It doesn't matter how small it is. Anybody on any idea what the first part of any business is? There's only 3. Sales. You got to get work. You got to have work before you can make a profit or anything else. Number 2, what's the second part? Cost. Customer. It's product. Okay, and all of those things would fall under what we call operations. Here's another way to think about it. Get work, do work. I told you John's real simple, right? Doesn't matter how big your business is or how small it is. You can be a single, self-employed entrepreneur. You could be an accountant. Put your little shingle out, get your CPA, I do your taxes. What do you got to do? Sell. You got to get customers. If people don't come and pay you to do their taxes, you really don't have a business. So you got to be able to sell, get work, and then you have to do the work. What's the third part of every business? Documentation. Well, that's nice. Keep your that's part of operations. And that's actually the lecture tomorrow is on customers, get one and keep one. So we're going to talk very specifically about that. Yes? Leadership? Huh? Finish the work. So the third part of a business is the finance department, otherwise known as accounting. So you have to get the work, do the work, and then you have the green visors. They count the work. They measure the success and they measure the profitability and the math. It's a report card back to the rest of the business because think about it. Anybody can sell if you're cheap or the lowest price. But then you have to do the work and make a profit at it. And then lastly, the accountants give you a report card to tell you whether you're actually making a profit in operations and if you're selling it for the right price or not. All 3 are vital. And if you're a self-employed entrepreneur working by yourself, guess what? You wear all those hats in the business. Sometimes you're sales, sometimes you're ops out there carpentry building a house, and sometimes you're the bookkeeper at home at night after hours. That's your second gig. It's your side gig, it's your side job, you're doing the accounting. And so you think about those 3 things that are so critical as we move forward. I started the construction lecture here with the structures of the business. So those 3 parts of the structure apply to all 3 types of businesses. Now what I've done is I've very generally tried to break up the three types of businesses. You have the self-employed entrepreneur, business owner. You might be one employee, might have a couple employees. Number two, you have the small business owner, where you start to have a different set of skills that come in, and then the larger business enterprise. So here's what I mean by self-employed. Typically, they are craftsmen, they are tradesmen, they're skilled workers, and they migrate from being an employee to being self-employed. So they hang their shingle out, they work for themselves, and what do they end up doing? We've got a couple biblical examples of self-employed business people. Well, where'd it go? There we are. Paul the tent maker. Peter the fisherman. Lydia was in the textile business. Remember in the book of Acts, talks about how she was the maker of purple? So part of what she did in making purple, do you know who bought what she made? Rich people. Trust me, rich people are great to work for, because even in a down economy, they still have money, and they're willing to spend it. It's a good thing. I like working for people with money. I do not like working for people that don't have money, because then when the invoice goes out, sometimes it's difficult to collect on the backside. So credit checks are good. It's another small tip. But you think about Paul as a tent maker. We talked about that earlier. Peter is a fisherman. The self-employed entrepreneur is gifted in their craft. They have vision and see the need for their goods and services. So the distinction between the self-employed entrepreneur and the small business owner is the self-employed entrepreneur, they wear their sales hat sometimes, but most of their focus is on how they deliver the goods to serve their customer. And self-employed attorneys can fall under this. I've got a bunch of examples up here. Carpenters, contractors, accountants, lawyers, painters, landscapers, engineering consultants. I've got friends that went and got a mechanical engineering degree, worked for somebody for a few years in their apprenticeship, got enough experience, got licensed, and they went out on their own, and now they're consultants to architectural firms as electrical engineers and mechanical engineers. But basically, they're a one-man band. Civil engineers, it's a big thing today, water retention ponds, if you're building any buildings. I just finished building a new office in Knoxville, and the biggest nightmare of all was navigating the Knoxville city's demands on how we're going to hold water on a pond that's bigger than the size of this room here. Took up half the lot, it seemed like, and all the parking for the cars. But we had to have a civil engineer consult us on the design of that pond. But he's a one-man band. He answers the phone, talks to the architects, does his designs. Photographers, butcher, baker, the candlestick maker. I think you get the gist of it, right? The saddle maker, the hat makers, tavern owners. Many in early America fall into this category. They were self-employed. There was a very large percentage of the population that they would just hang out their shingle. They would apprentice to somebody. When they became a skilled worker of whatever trade or craft they were working on, they hung out their sign, and eventually they were in business for themselves. So here's something that's critical. They still had vision, because what they saw was, and I put an example up here, and I'm using some extreme examples, kind of hyperbolic, right, to try to really illustrate what we're saying. I used the example earlier, I can't remember, it might have been this morning or last night, about the buggy whip maker, the leather maker, that pivoted as their business determined that. So carpenters make coffins during a plague and boats during a flood. What they understand is they're not a coffin maker. They're not a boat maker. And too often, the self-employed entrepreneur gets pigeonholed into thinking, well, I make furniture. No, you're a carpenter. You make what the market demands you will make. And that's the thing I want you to take away from this, is it doesn't matter what we want to do as the business owner. What matters? Thank you. We are here to serve the customer. It's what the customer is willing to pay us for. So if you're a carpenter, the vision you have to have is you have to figure out what does the market want? What are they willing to pay? And then maybe what's the most recurring nature? What could I produce that they'll want over and over and over? So you streamline your process, profit margins go up. Another example, Ben Franklin. He was a printer. He was an inventor. He invented the Franklin wood stove. Here's the one I wanted you to see. The Apostle Paul, the church planner. He was an entrepreneur. Yes, he was called particularly by God to a very specific calling, but he was entrepreneurial. You read through the book of Acts. I challenge every one of you, go read, study it deeply. Paul is not just moving through Asia Minor haphazardly. There's a deep vision and intentionality where he goes, what city he goes to, where he sets up shop. You remember where does he go? Almost every time he goes into a city, what does he go first? Where does he go first? The synagogue. He preaches for about 3 weeks, then they throw him out. And then what's he do? There's several examples in Acts where he goes down the road and 2 doors down, puts a mailbox out and says, Paul's School of Christian Theology. Right? He is intentional. It's not by accident. And this is something that we should be thinking about, even in the church. We should do what we do with intentionality. Paul goes to a certain city because he knows that there's a certain group of people there that he's going to preach to, and they are going to what? Propagate the gospel to all the outlying regions. He doesn't start by going over here to some small backwater town where there's 50 people that live there. He's going to a main metropolis because he understands the trade and everything that's going on and how the gospel is going to spread through the whole world at that time. He's got a vision to take world dominion, not just his little comfort zone. Think about that. That's entrepreneurial, and we should be thinking about that the same way. There's a couple other examples I'm throwing out there of people that have some vision. English is a second language, a teacher online. So some of we talked earlier today about what, I might like to be a small business. I might like to be self-employed as an entrepreneur. How about teaching English as a second language? Do you remember back about 4 years ago, there was an eclipse? I don't know, it might have been 5 years ago, and it was coming over Tennessee, not too far from where here. So I drove up to the Smoky Mountains with my kids. Man, we are going to watch this eclipse. I'm excited. I've got all my kids, and we're heading up there. My wife's back at home. She's like, I'm not hiking that mountain. You're crazy. We got about 3/4 of the way up, and the eclipse is starting, and we've got the perfect view of it. And we're right on this overlook, this curve in the trail, and the trees are all leveled out there, and we can see the sun, and we can see the moon and everything, and this cloud comes over. I'm like, you have got to be kidding me. 30 minutes later, the cloud leaves, and the eclipse is over. Sorry, kids, maybe in another lifetime. But that story does have some interest to this lecture. It wasn't just because I'm interested in astronomy, because I'm really not. I just thought it was a great science thing for a bunch of homeschoolers to go up and show my kids what an eclipse looked like. But at the end, that's right. But at the end of the day, I'm getting back in my vehicle, and this guy comes walking down. I notice he's got a New Hampshire license plate. And I said, hey, so did you come for the eclipse too? I drove down from New Hampshire. I said, oh, I'm so sorry the clouds are. He's like, hey, it happens. I said, well, what do you do? Like the middle of the week, you're able to take off and come all the way down here? He said, I teach English as a second language online. And I set my own schedule. I set my own hours. Makes a full-time living, supports his family by teaching English online. He said he has a lot of students from China and other things. These are entrepreneurial types of activities that the internet with Teams and Zoom, it's amazing what you can do with a small business. Airstream renovation. Think about taking an old Airstream, renovating it, and then reselling it. It's amazing the margins that can be made in that area. Now, not to be confused with the business lecture here, really there's a fourth underlying thread. The whole time I've been here, it's been a pitch. I want you to go to the mission field. Entrepreneurial mission work. Think about the Apostle Paul. Think about the last one up here, tourist guide missionaries. Do you guys have any idea? Have you heard about the 1040 window? Anybody? Anybody? What's the 1040 window? Where the majority of the people live? 2/3 of the world's population lives within the parallels of the 1040 window. Okay? It's basically kind of like North Africa, the Middle East, Asia. That strip, if you look at a map of the world, they call that the 1040 window. 2/3 of the population lives in the 1040 window. Just think about that for a minute. There's landmass there, but think about China, Russia, the United States. A lot more landmass. North America, we're not in the 1040 window. And it's mostly populated by Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists. You know what percentage of Christian missionaries work in the 1040 window? Most of them? 1%? You're closer than most. 2%? You're getting closer. 3.3%. Out of every 100 missionaries that our churches send out, 3 go to the 1040 window. Let that sink in for a minute. And it's the majority of the lost world, where the gospel hasn't even penetrated into some areas. So here's what I want you to think about. I've got a friend that just got back from one of the countries I can't say because it's closed and for security reasons, but in the 1040 window, and they do mission work, and they enter the area, because you can't go in as a Christian missionary. They won't let you in the country. The government won't give you a visa. So they've penetrated the country as tourist guides. And they have a website, and they come back. You know, people from the United States go over there, and you think about all the tourism in all those areas. And what they do is they have a business, a legitimate business. You see where I'm going with this? I'm connecting business and mission work. That's what we're called to do. We're called to take dominion. We're called to take this world for the name of Jesus Christ. We are his army that takes the kingdom forward. And we can do it through business and mission work at the same time. So these guys, they set up a tourist guide business. They bring Americans in, and guess what they do with those Americans? They go to all the outlying villages. Let me show you around. Let me show you how these people live over here. Let me show you what it's like crossing this river on a rope bridge. Let me show you over here. And guess what they're doing the whole time they're doing it? They're planting churches and visiting those churches over and over. And guess what they're really doing? The people that are coming as tourist guides or as tourists are Christians from churches in the United States that are going to encourage those home churches, those secret churches, sharing the gospel and sharing with them what's going on in the United States, and they're trying to encourage them in their faith. And they're doing it through business. That's what I want you guys to see, is the opportunity that's here. If you want to be self-employed, think about it. How can I do it as a missionary using business as the means to penetrate an unpenetrated opportunity in nation? That the world, remember what we said earlier? Think about, and here's what I really want you to take away. It's about risk. Are you willing to lay down your life for the one who laid down his life for us? Because that's what we're called to do. Yeah, we're called to do it as husbands and fathers, and we lay down our lives by providing for our families and all of those other things. But how about the dying world that needs to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ? So I want you to think about that and say, is God calling you to set up a small business as a self-employed entrepreneur like the Apostle Paul? that you might penetrate a part of the world that doesn't even know who Jesus is, that's never even heard his name, that has no idea. They need to hear the gospel. And business is a valuable, invaluable way to penetrate those markets. So you need to talk to your pastors and your sessions and ask them, hey, do you think, if you have that burning desire deep down in your soul that I want to see the lost saved, think about that. And God's gifted me and equipped me with a certain skill set. Maybe he's trained you as an accountant. Guess what? The Big Four have offices all over the world. And I guarantee you, they're not knocking down the door to go to the Middle East. And think about that skill. I know a training center in Brazil right now. Doug Lehman's the missionary there, training people in Brazil. You know why they're training people in Brazil? At this particular mission center, they're training them to do computer coding and software. They train them for a year. It's a theological training. They give them Bible training. But guess what they're really training them to do? To go to places where Americans won't and can't. That's what I want you to hear for a minute. Won't. Why not? We're too comfortable. We got it too easy. But the kid that grows up in Brazil with nothing, who got converted and loves Jesus, he's willing to lay it on the line and go into North Korea. How about us? What are we willing to do? What are we willing to lay on the line for the gospel? And they're training these men, these young men, to be able to go penetrate unpenetrable markets that, number one, won't allow Americans in, and number two, that American kids won't go to. That's my call. If God's calling you to be a self-employed entrepreneur, how can you leverage that to use it, not just in the United States, but for his glory in an unreachable nation? I bet you didn't expect that one, did you? So, next, small business owners. Now we start to get to the meat in the kind of the bones of the whole discussion here. It's a different skill. It's a different calling to be a small business owner. You have to learn that you no longer are just a tradesman. You no longer are just employing your craft, but you have to manage other people. In other words, here's the way I heard a mentor say it to me. John, you need to learn to get stuff done through somebody else. That's difficult. It's difficult when you do it. Man, I can do it really well, and then somebody else does it not maybe quite as good. And that's a skill that you have to learn to delegate to others and let them blossom in their skills and abilities. You have to spend time training others. And notice what I put up there, the scripture verse about giving cheerfully. And I know that in context he's dealing with tithing and other things there, but we also give of our time. In investing in others, we need to do it cheerfully because it's a privilege. Hear me on that. If you're thinking about starting a small business and you're going to have employees, it's a privilege that the Lord gives you to manage other people. They are trusting you with their livelihood. Let that sink in for a minute. They're trusting you. There's a confidence in you. And you know what? That's a weighty thing. When those families are counting on your business to provide for them, don't take it lightly. You need to invest in them, in their skills and abilities. You need to learn to serve your customers on a larger scale than the self-employed individual. You need to transition from being a craftsman to a business owner. You need to learn to get things done through others. You need to learn to delegate. Now here I'm going to give you a couple facts. Those are kind of some of the skills that are required for the small business owner. These are just some facts. The small business owner represents 43.5% of the United States gross domestic product. Think about that. Almost half. It's not Wall Street, it's Main Street. They employ 46% of the private sector workforce. Why is that statistic so important? Does anybody else like statistics and analysis? I love it. It's because the data always tells a story. The accounting tells a story. We may not know exactly what it is, but it tells us something. Notice I emphasize private sector, because there's a large portion of the population, and I forgot what the number is, I didn't put it in the lecture, that works for the public sector. So you think about small business. You have all these Fortune 500 companies that employ hundreds of thousands of people, but it's the small business owner with less than 100 employees that employs 46%, almost 50% of the workforce. Think about the influence, the opportunity to influence half the country for the gospel if you join the ranks of the small business owner. But here's the scary statistics. The failure rate of small business is 20% in the first 2 years, 45% in the first 5, and 65% in the first 10 years. Now, I've got a lot of thoughts and reasons why. I think a lot of people that are really energized and motivated become disenfranchised, disenchanted with the idea of being a small business owner. So you start to see this attrition rate taking as they start to realize what's really required. By the way, it's like having a second job. You never turn. I was talking with one of the young men here at lunch. You never turn it off. You go work for a Fortune 500 company. A lot of people like that because when they get off work at 4 o'clock, they can go home and they focus on whatever else they want to in their personal life. And I'm not saying that that's sinful or anything like that, but I'm just telling you that wasn't for Jon Eskola. 4 o'clock came, I was coming off the roof and then going into the accounting part of my business or the sales part of my business. I just enjoyed all the other aspects of my business. You have to be willing to sacrifice to make it successful. I've not talked to one small business owner, not one, that didn't make sacrifices in the first 5 years of their business. And I don't just mean monetarily, but I mean with time and everything else. They worked 6 days a week, 12 hours a day plus to get through. But guess what? You want to become a medical doctor? Dell, was residency an 8-hour-a-day job? Yeah. 80 hours a week. So it's not like, hey, I started my own business, so I don't have to put the time in. You're going to put the time in somewhere if you're going to attain to certain levels of professionalism. So now we're going to talk about the top reasons for failure. Top 5. Help me. I'm falling and I can't get up. Number 1, lack of market knowledge. This is one of the big ones. And think about market knowledge. It's not just about the good or service. It's not just about the demand or the need. It's also about, what's the first one I put up there? Competition. So I'm just going to use roofing as an example. I'm considering opening an office in Louisville, Kentucky. What's the first thing I go do? I go search and see how many roofers are there, how good are they. I start doing all my market research and figure out, I try to develop an idea of the demand, the size of the market, volume-wise. One of the ways we do that is we Google up and figure out all the square footage of buildings that are there. We go look at the city information about pieces of property data and the square footage size of it. We kind of come up with an idea of the square footage in an area. We know from history that a certain percentage of it needs to be replaced every year. We do this analysis, okay? It's not something that's just willy-nilly. Hey, man, I really like Louisville. It's on the river in Kentucky. It's where the horses are. I want to go open a roofing business there, so once a year I can go up there for the Kentucky Derby. No. We're looking at competition and market need and demand. And then when we're evaluating the competition, we're evaluating the quality. And once we've done all that and we have a really good idea, we actually can start to mathematically project what size that branch might actually look like. And then we start building the org chart around that. Okay, so that's just kind of a couple ideas. Number 2 is a poor business plan. Most important thing there is a lack of focus. Remember we talked about in the last lecture about the hedgehog principle? You know, the reason they call it the hedgehog principle is the hedgehog is very focused little furry animal. And he's just good at one thing. And so they've got that idea. He's not running around doing all kinds of things. It's just one thing. And so a poor business plan with a lack of focus. So I'll give you an example. If you are in the, let's call it the lawn care landscaping business. I've got multiple friends that are in that. Within the lawn care landscaping business, there's subsets of that. You guys know what hardscape is? It's like fire pits and grills and stuff out in the backyard, and they do the stone work and all that kind of fancy stuff. That's for those people that have money, by the way. I got a friend that's in the hardscape business down on the beach in New Jersey. It's amazing, the profit margins in that business. Because come Labor Day, they want it all done. And they want to be ready to go spend the summer at their beach house with the new fire pit and the grill and the pizza oven and the whatever. It's crazy what they spend on some of those things. But that's a subset of the lawn care landscaping business. Then you actually have the mowing of the grass. By the way, that's the recurring revenue piece that has to be consistently done every week, unless we're in a drought. And then you have the landscaping, which gets into the planting of the trees and everything. So the first and the last are project-based. The one in the middle is recurring revenue. So you have to figure out which one you're going to focus on, and then you can build out the business from there. Does that make sense? Right, so it's important that you have focus there. I've seen businesses fail because they tried to be all things to all people. Here's one thing that's really clear. We get calls all the time from Miss Grandma and Susie Q and Billy Bub and Fred. Would you come roof my house? No. Click. We don't do residential work. We actually recommend them to somebody else, but the decision's already made. We just don't do it. We focus on one certain thing. We know what we do. We're good at it. We don't want to go do this over here. But it can be very attractive sometimes. I got a call the other day. They said, hey, John, we have this $100 million job we'd like you to look at. Well, what is it? Well, we want you to build this building. And then I said, no, thanks. I'm not a general contractor. But it was an opportunity. I mean, for a split second, it's like, wow, that's a big job. And it becomes a shiny object that you can get distracted by. Anybody ever been distracted? At our house, we call it squirrel. Right? There goes Dad. He's off on another rabbit trail. Squirrel. Please come back. John, the children, this is what we're talking about. Whew. Stay focused. Have a business plan that's focused. Accurate budget and timelines. Third one's lack of capital. Whenever you go into business, you better understand what it's going to cost to fund this thing for whatever period of time till you're turning a profit. You better understand how to bootstrap it, how to bootleg it, and everything else in between. And I could tell you all kinds of stories of how we capitalized our business to, and there's creative ways to do it. It's unbelievable. Believe it or not, as much as I don't like our tax code, there is an incentive in the tax code for small businesses to succeed. Cash basis, tax reporting, all kinds of things. I mean, you can show losses year over year. It doesn't, let me reemphasize that, tax deferred. The piper's coming calling sometime. But in the meantime, you might, if you're wise and you understand how to plan that, you can use that tax deference to finance the growth of the business. And at some point in time, you reach a certain level, there's a 3-year average, and I forgot the dollar amounts. I should call my CFO and ask him. He'll tell you exactly what it is. But it's allows you to grow to a certain level, and when you get to that level, that's the year you've got to pay the taxes. But it provides capital. So it doesn't mean the taxes go away, but there are legal ways to help. Besides that, capital can come from private investors, can come from family members. You know, it's not like I'm a big fan of guys like Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, but there are business lessons that we can learn from them. Jeff Bezos is one at Amazon. You know, several of his family members invested when he first started in his garage in the book business, $10,000. That stock became worth like $1 billion. I'm not saying that everybody in the family that puts $10,000 into the lawn care business is going to become a billionaire, but my point is that there are other avenues of capital that you can bring into the business. Location and marketing, it's kind of like real estate. Location's everything. Depending on the type of business you're in, that can become very critical. Expanding too fast. Well, let me tell you, Eskola Roofing's been growing at a pace that's ridiculous. But what we did was we planned for the growth. We actually have a 1-year plan, a 3-year plan, a 5-year plan. And it was funny, I was looking at some of the numbers the other day. We did in 18 months what we planned to do in 5 years. And we spent 3 months this year because we're about to break our back office. Does anybody know what the back office is? It's that third part of the business over there, the finance accounting department that has to count the money, and we roll up HR under that and other back office things. So you got the sales team, you got the operations team, and you got this team over here. So here's what's kind of critical about the back office is if it's not big enough, you'll break it. So we had to put this organizational structure and realignment in place in our company to help support the growth. And that's true for any size business. We've done that a dozen times. You might hire a bookkeeper, but then it's not enough. You have to move to the next level to a controller. Eventually, you might need a CFO with a controller. Eventually, you might need 2 controllers. And I think you get the idea. You have to build an organizational chart and structure. So we already talked about the broad set of skill sets. Turn with me to the book of Ruth. Let's spend a couple minutes here looking at Ruth. Here's what I want you to see with Ruth. Boaz was a good biblical example of this small business owner. He ran a farming enterprise successfully without compromising his biblical standards. You know, it was during a dark time in Israel's history. Baal was worshipped as the god of fertility and rain, god of materialism, prosperity. But Boaz was a shining light in the darkness. I want you to look at chapter 2, verse 1. There was a relative of Naomi's husband, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech. His name was Boaz, a man of great wealth. Let's look at chapter 4, verse 1. Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the close relative of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Come aside, friend, sit down." So he came aside and sat down. Verse 2, he took 10 men of the elders of the city and sat down here. He was a man trusted in the gates. So he's not only a man of wealth, but he was a trusted man. And he was a leader in his business and community. Now here's some of the real practical things I want you to see about Boaz. That he greeted his employees in a godly way. When I was studying this, it's probably one of the best examples in the scripture of a godly man running a business, not just as a self-employed individual. Look at chapter 2, verse 4. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, I draw your attention to the plurality there. The Lord be with you. And he blessed them. He greeted his employees in a godly way. Look at verse 9 and 15. he had an expectation of godly behavior from his employees. What does he say to them? Let your eyes be on the field. Have not I commanded the young men not to touch you? When you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn. In other words, he expected his young men to treat Ruth with respect as a young godly woman in his business. He had expectations for his employees of how they were to act. Number 3, he was not an ivory tower leader. So you see Boaz, where's he coming? He's not back in the home office somewhere up in Chicago in the Sears Tower just counting the money. Boaz is where? Out in the field with the reapers. He's inspecting the work. He's seeing what they're doing. He's rubbing shoulders with his employees. In Ruth chapter 3, verse 7, and after Boaz had eaten and drunk, his heart was cheerful. He went to lie down at the end of the heap of the grain. He's on the threshing floor with his fellow workers, his co-workers. He's there with them, engaged. Look at Ruth chapter 2, verse 6. He has a management structure. So the servant who is in charge of the reapers. So it's not just Boaz, but he's got this management structure. He's got a superintendent or a foreman in the field that's overseeing the work that's going on. Think about the planting, the weeding, the care, the harvesting. They're in the harvest season here in this example. In verse 2 through 14, Boaz said to her at mealtime, come here and eat of the bread and dip your piece of the bread in the vinegar. And he gave her grain. She ate and was satisfied. In other words, he was generous with what he had. He shared with others. And in chapter 2, verse 16, let grain from the bundles fall purposely for her. He's giving instructions to his reapers for the gleaners. In other words, he reflected the word of God in how he lived. He didn't just read the law about the gleaners, but he actually went to his men and said, here's what I want you to do. Live according to the word. I want you to live it out in your life. And so, what does Boaz do? He instructs them. You're to take care of Ruth. She's a gleaner. Who are the gleaners? They are the poor of the society. Notice what he doesn't do. He just doesn't give away a free welfare program. He actually encourages the poor by making the work of gleaning easier. Here's what I want you to see here. He honored and rewarded the dignity of work. Let that just sink in for a minute. He was concerned about the poor, but he also understood God's economy and how it works, and he was executing that faithfully as a godly Christian man. I tell you, I love the story of Boaz. It's so encouraging when you read it. Think about how we can take and apply that in all of our lives. Especially if you're a small business person and you have the opportunity to encourage others in their work and respect the dignity of work. Here's the other thing that was kind of exciting. He knew how to enjoy the blessings of the Lord too. In other words, this guy wasn't Scrooge. Bah humbug. No, he enjoyed what the Lord had blessed him with. He was with his men drinking and eating, and then they laid down on the threshing floor on the heap of grain, went to sleep. He was cheerful. He loved his work, he loved his men, and he loved serving the Lord through his business. I mean, doesn't that excite y'all? I mean, that excites me when I think about it. So then you start thinking about the third piece of business structure. We talked about the self-employed entrepreneur, the small business owner, and now larger business organizations. You know, really the only major difference between small business organization and a larger business organization is the scalability. You have things like people, more processes in place. You become more of a process-driven organization. And a lot of times it's based on customer demand, product demand, capital constraints. But it really requires, if you're interested in scaling up into a larger organization, there's a whole, notice the last one on here, vision in leadership that's necessary. there are steps you have to put in place in order to scale up. And it just doesn't happen by accident. And that goes for any organization in that sense. Here's a biblical example. Abraham had how many men? 318. Trained men. That's right. I mean, think about that. This is kind of a big enterprise, right? I mean, that's a large group of people. So Abraham was running his agricultural operation pretty effectively. There's a case study I want to share with you here in a minute. We just got a few more minutes. It's the story of Rudolph Diesel. Anybody know? Well, I put up there what he is. I should have left that. I got to learn that tech thing. Hey, at least we got the clicker working, right? And the microphone? My kids were texting me last night. Are you kidding me, Dad? Come on, you're embarrassing the whole family. But that was the kids away from here. The kids here were coming up to me and telling me. They didn't have to text. Come on, Dad, the microphone? Really? My wife's at home going, oh, John, how do you ever run a business? I don't know, honey, can you help me choose my socks? But you notice I don't care what I dress when I go to work, right? Here's the truth. The reason I own my own business is because I can wear whatever I want to when I go to work, because I'm not wearing a suit. And I choose to be in the roofing business because there's no expectation of being in a suit. Yeah, I'll tell you a funny story. I was at an investor conference in Atlanta speaking before a group of investors that manage, some pretty large portfolios. And the invitation came to my email, and it says, no blue jeans or no denim. So I'm looking at it. It's at some fancy country club and stuff. And I get down there, and of course, I will say I had a sport jacket on. I know when I should be respectful of the appropriate audience. Well, they weren't going to let me in at the country club if I showed up without it. So I had to if I wanted to speak. And so I'm getting ready to go up and speak, and the audiovisual guys are at the back. And when I get up to the front, I said, okay, who organized this meeting, this summit at this country club and invites a roofer? Are y'all kidding me? Now, you got it. Some of these people are managing some very large sums, and they're in some pretty fancy three-piece suits and stuff. I said, next time I come, I'm going to have the audio guy play my walk-up song is Garth Brooks, Friends in Low Places. They all laughed too, by the way. And so, it was like, who wants a roofer to come speak at a country club before investors? Do you not realize we wear blue jeans and hard hats? So here's the thing about Rudolph Diesel. He was the inventor of the diesel engine. There was a really fascinating book. It's just a fun read called The Mysterious Case of Rudolph Diesel. Has anybody read it? It's great. I won't give you the spoiler alert. You'll never believe anything you read in the newspapers again after you read it. But Diesel worked with a very large, I believe it was Mann Industries in Germany. And see, here's the thing, right? A self-employed entrepreneur can achieve certain things. A small business organization can achieve other things. But there are certain things that require large amounts of resources and capital. Do you realize that 99% of the ship freight that's moved across the ocean all over the place is powered by diesel engines? It transforms. The early 1900s, Rudolph transformed the technology. So here's a pitch for engineers. I threw them under the bus earlier this morning, but Andy, this one's for you. Rudolph was a genius as an engineer, and he designed the diesel engine, and he was backed by a very large business organization. He never could have accomplished what he needed to because he never would have had the resources. So my point is this. There's a time and place for every one of these structures. It's not just one size fits all. God may be calling you to be a self-employed entrepreneur, to be a missionary. He may be calling you to be a small business owner, but he may be calling you to function in a very large business organization and do something transformative like Rudolph Diesel. So on that note, I think I have about 4 minutes left. 2. I got time for one question. You asked that one tonight. It's a softball. Any other questions? No? All right, thank you all very much.